The water is cold beyond measure, a suffocating embrace that seems to pull the life from the body within seconds. But the divers have learned to master fear, to channel it into focus, into the methodical movements required to survive beneath waves that conceal not only the unseen dangers of depth and current, but the deliberate rain of bullets from above. The harbor at Naples lies shattered, its docks torn and twisted by months of bombardment, rendered useless by the very forces meant to liberate the port from Axis control. The ships rest sideways on the harbor floor, their hulls pierced like skin by shrapnel and explosives. Cargo containers, barrels, and twisted metals scaffold the underwater landscape. Somewhere above, German and Italian snipers wait in the rubble of warehouses, their rifles trained on anything that moves near the water's edge. Somewhere below, mines rest on anchor chains and dock supports, patient and invisible in the murk. The diver descends into this chaos with nothing but a knife, a hammer, a length of rope, and the signal line connecting him to the tender on the surface. His suit is heavy, 50 pounds or more of wool and canvas, saturated with salt water, and weighted down further by lead belts and boots designed to keep him anchored against the currents that sweep through the harbor like invisible hands trying to tear him away. The apparatus on his chest is mechanical and ancient by modern standards, a closed-circuit rebreather that circulates his exhaled breath through a chemical scrubber to remove carbon dioxide, allowing him to breathe again, to stretch his oxygen further than an open system would allow. The helmet is a Copper Mark V, its faceplate small and round, allowing only a narrow cone of vision into water so turbid that visibility rarely exceeds a few feet. In Naples, visibility on a good day might reach 10 feet. On most days, it is 3 or 4. On this day is nearly 0. The tender above feels the signal line go taut. 3 pulls means the diver has reached the bottom. 2 pulls back is the signal acknowledged. The routine begins, the ancient language of rope and tension that has sustained diving operations since the days when men first dared descend beneath the waves. But this is no salvage expedition or scientific research. This is war conducted in an environment where sound is distorted, where light becomes a luxury, where a single mistake means death not from enemy fire, but from the simple physics of drowning or nitrogen narcosis or the inexorable pressure that crushes the human body. The diver's hands move despite the cold, despite the numbness that creeps through the wool suit. His fingers are stiffened almost to uselessness, but years of training have taught them to work through the sensation, to respond to muscle memory more than feeling. He is searching for a cable, a thick steel hawser that runs from the dock to sunken ship, its path a trap for any vessel trying to enter or leave the harbor. One jerk of this cable could ensnare a propeller, disable a ship, transform an instant of carelessness into catastrophe. The knife comes out, a blade specifically designed for underwater work, with a slight curve that catches and holds whatever he needs to cut. The metal of the ship's hull is rough beneath his gloved fingers, textured with barnacles and the deterioration of months submerged. He positions the knife and saws, the motion deliberate and exhausting, every muscle in his upper body engaged in an effort that would be simple on dry land but becomes underwater, a battle against gravity and pressure, and the inherent resistance of water to movement. Above, German spotters scan the harbor with binoculars. A ripple in the water, a piece of floating debris, a telltale current that betrays the presence of a diver tending equipment from below. Any of these could draw sniper fire. The tenders on the surface move as quickly as they can, but speed is a luxury when precision is required. The smoke screens are already in place, billowing screens of chemical smoke that rise from canisters deployed at strategic points around the harbor's edge. The smoke is meant to blind the snipers, to obscure their sight lines, but the wind is capricious and unreliable. Sometimes the smoke thickens and creates a perfect barrier. Sometimes it disperses, and for a terrible moment, the divers below and the support personnel above are exposed, vulnerable, holding their breath as if silence and stillness alone might render them invisible. The cable severs. 50 feet below, the diver feels the sudden release of tension, the cable drifting away into the murk. His hands are shaking now, not from cold alone, but from exertion and the constant low-level awareness of danger. One objective complete. The signal line pulls gently, a question from a surface. Are you all right? One pull back, yes. The journey upward begins, a process that must be controlled and deliberate. Rise too quickly, and the nitrogen bubbles forming in his blood will expand too rapidly, creating decompression sickness, a condition that can paralyze or kill. The ascent must be gauged to the depth and time spent below. The tables are committed to memory, numbers that have become a diver's mantra. For his depth and duration, he must ascend slowly, stopping at prescribed intervals to allow his body to adjust to the changing pressure. These stops are mandatory and dangerous. At these depths, he is still vulnerable to sniper fire, still visible if the smoke has moved or cleared. But visibility remains poor, and poor visibility has become a blessing in this new kind of warfare. He rises into increasingly lighter water, though lighter remains a relative term in the murky harbor. The rope above grows tauter as he climbs, and the tender above feels each stage of the ascent, ready to haul him to the surface if danger demands it, ready to adjust the supply of air flowing down from the topside apparatus. Diving is a partnership between the man below and the team above. The tender must remain utterly attentive, must read the signals in the rope with the precision of a musician reading a score. A mistaken interpretation, a moment of inattention, could mean the difference between a successful mission and a tragedy. The diver breaks the surface with a gasp that is almost involuntary, his body demanding fresh air despite the fact that his rebreather has been recirculating oxygen throughout the dive. He is hauled from the water by waiting hands, and the process of decompression on the surface begins. He cannot simply walk away from a dive. His body must continue to adjust, and he must remain in conditions where medical support is available if decompression sickness develops. The pain can be extraordinary, joints seized as if locked in ice, the sensation of being stabbed from within as nitrogen bubbles form in the tissues and blood. Experienced divers call it the bends, a civilian affliction that became tragically common among the deep-sea workers who first experienced it. But in wartime, a diver with the bends is still expected to remain on duty, to return to work as soon as possible, because the job is never finished and the demand is always endless. The diver removes his helmet, and his face is gray with exhaustion, every muscle knotted with fatigue. His hair is matted and cold, and his eyes are unfocused, still adjusting to the transition from the narrow cone of vision inside the helmet to the full scope of the world. Around him, the harbor is controlled chaos. More divers are being prepared for the next descent. Equipment is being checked, helmets inspected for cracks in the faceplate or seal, air hoses tested, lead weights accounted for. A naval officer approaches with a clipboard, asking questions, recording data. Were there other obstacles below? Minefields? Evidence of booby trap installations? The diver's answers are recorded, becoming part of the intelligence that will inform the next dive and the next. Naples is not the only harbor where this war is being waged beneath the waves. In Anzio, just south of Rome, the situation is even more dire. The beachhead is precarious, held by forces that are thinly stretched and under constant pressure from German counterattacks. The harbor at Anzio is littered with the remains of Allied amphibious craft, scuttled deliberately to form breakwaters, their hulls creating artificial barriers against the sea and enemy attack. But these same wrecks also obstruct the harbor, preventing supply ships from entering, strangling the beachhead with shortage. Divers must work in water so cold that hypothermia becomes a constant threat, where every minute below drains not just oxygen but body heat itself. The temperatures in the Tyrrhenian Sea in winter can drop to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and exposure suits in this era are not the insulated neoprene of later generations but wool and canvas, which actually conduct heat away from the body. One diver at Anzio, a rating named Thompson from Manchester, has completed 17 dives in a single day, each one deeper and longer than the last. His body is screaming with exhaustion, every nerve ending on fire, his mind locked in a state of hypervigilance because snipers operate here too, and occasionally German boats venture into the harbor to harass the Allied operations. Thompson's hands are so numb that they have become almost useless. A medical orderly has examined them and warned that he is at risk of frostbite, that if he continues, he risks permanent damage to his fingers, perhaps to his hands. But there's one more cable to cut, one more obstacle to clear, and the supply ships are waiting. Without those supplies, men will die, not divers but infantrymen in a line, waiting for ammunition and medical supplies. Thompson descends again into the black water, and his hands work despite their limitations, despite the pain that is almost electric in its intensity as blood begins to return to his fingers. At Cherbourg, the situation is different in character but no less demanding. The port here was methodically destroyed by the retreating Germans before the Americans could capture it. The Germans took their role as expert sappers seriously, and they planted mines not just in the conventional sense, but rigged explosions that transformed entire structures into booby traps. The harbor mouth is a maze of sunken vessels, some deliberately sunk to block the channel, others destroyed in place. The water is colder here, influenced by Atlantic currents, and the tidal flows are among the strongest in the world. Divers working in Cherbourg must contend with currents that push them sideways even as they try to descend, that threaten at every moment to tear them away from their lines and sweep them out to sea. The divers here use hammers as much as knives because much of the work involves breaking apart the concrete structures that the Germans reinforced and destroyed. The explosives have left the concrete splintered and dangerous, with sharp edges that threaten to snag suits, helmets, and air hoses. A diver named Davies, who has worked at Cherbourg for 3 weeks, has learned to move through the currents with the grace of a dancer, using the immense weight of his diving suit not as a burden, but as an anchor, keeping himself pressed against the structures he is dismantling. He has also learned that the water here is frequently warm enough to see perhaps 6 or 7 feet, which by the standards of this work seems almost luxurious. But the visibility makes him nervous because it means that anything moving in the water can potentially see him, and he can see them. On his 3rd week, Davies encounters something unexpected. At approximately 60 feet, emerging from the murk, is the form of another diver. For a terrible moment, Davies believes he is hallucinating, that nitrogen narcosis has clouded his mind and created an illusion. But the figure is real. It is a German diver, part of the German Navy's specialist units, also working to clear the harbor, but on whose behalf, for whose side? Davies has no weapon. Divers of this era rarely do. The equipment is too specialized, the environment too hostile to the use of firearms. What he has is the knife at his belt and the knowledge that a man in a diving suit is both incredibly strong and incredibly vulnerable. A puncture in the suit would be catastrophic. A severed air hose would mean drowning within minutes. But Davies is also a professional, trained in war, and trained specifically in the knowledge that the seas belong to no nation in the conventional sense. What matters is function and survival. The two divers regard each other for what seems like an eternity, but is probably only seconds. Then, with a gesture that seems almost choreographed, they both turn away. The German diver disappears back into the murk in one direction, and Davies rises carefully in another. When he surfaces, he reports the encounter to his commanding officer, who listens with an expression that seems simultaneously unsurprised and deeply troubled. The report is filed, and Davies is asked not to speak of it further. By late 1944 at Antwerp, the situation has evolved into something approaching a systematic science, though no less dangerous for all that. The Belgians have worked with the British to establish a formal school for military divers, and the training is becoming more rigorous, more scientific. The divers are being taught not just the practical skills of cutting and clearing, but the theoretical foundations of pressure, buoyancy, and the physiology of human beings at depth. The equipment is improving incrementally. Better rebreathers, more reliable communication systems, helmets that are more carefully manufactured. But at Antwerp, the danger is not snipers but the Scheldt River itself, a waterway of such complexity and treachery that it has killed more sailors and soldiers than enemy action. The current is unpredictable, sometimes flowing north, sometimes south, sometimes seeming to flow in multiple directions simultaneously. The water is brackish, contaminated by industrial effluent and human waste, so murky that visibility is almost never more than a few feet and frequently drops to zero. A diver named Mackenzie has worked at Antwerp for the better part of 6 months. His hands are permanently scarred from cuts sustained on sharp metal edges encountered in the dark. His hearing has begun to deteriorate, a condition that the naval doctors tell him is probably temporary, probably related to repeated pressure changes, probably will resolve with time. He also has a persistent cough, which the doctors suggest is likely from inhaling trace amounts of carbon dioxide, despite the chemical scrubber in his rebreather. These are not unusual conditions. Most divers who have worked extensively develop similar complaints. But Mackenzie continues his work because the clearance operations have finally begun to show results. Vessels that had been unable to pass through the harbor for months are now beginning to move through the channel, their holds full of supplies and reinforcements. The work itself has evolved into a sort of grim routine. Each morning, the divers assemble, perform their pre-dive checks, and descend into the water. They work alone or in pairs, depending on the nature of the task. Some days, the objective is relatively straightforward. Cut a cable, remove a floating mine, clear debris from a navigation channel. Other days, the work becomes more complex and dangerous. When the Germans constructed certain obstacles, they sometimes employed what would later be called booby traps or anti-handling devices, systems designed such that moving or cutting one part of the structure would trigger an explosive charge. The divers must learn to recognize these devices and work around them, to report them to the sappers above so that explosives experts can render them safe from the surface. The communication between diver and surface is conducted through a rope, the signal line, that serves as both literal anchor and information conduit. A single pull on the rope means, "Are you all right?" 2 pulls mean, "Yes, I'm fine." 3 pulls mean, "I need assistance," or "I'm ascending," depending on context and the specific protocol established for that operation. The tender must maintain absolute focus on this rope at all times, must feel every vibration, every movement, must be capable of interpreting the signals with precision. Some tenders can almost read the mind of their diver through the rope, can sense not just the mechanical signals, but the emotional state of the man below, whether he is calm or panicked, confident or frightened. These tenders are invaluable, and they develop fierce loyalty to their divers, becoming almost like extensions of the divers themselves. The hazards multiply as the campaign progresses. Divers begin to encounter not just obstacles created by the enemy, but natural hazards that the sea itself creates. Silt accumulates on the harbor floor, and a careless movement can stir up clouds of silt so dense that visibility drops to absolute zero. When a diver is in zero visibility, he must navigate by touch alone, by feeling his way along the structures, by counting his hand movements to maintain a sense of spatial awareness. It is a form of sensory deprivation, and for many men it produces a form of panic that must be consciously suppressed. Some divers develop techniques to manage the fear. They sing to themselves silently, counting the rhythm to maintain focus. Others mentally recite poetry or prayers, anything to maintain a sense of connection to the human world above. Still others simply enter a state of almost meditative focus, letting their hands work while their minds withdraw to somewhere safer. The cold is perhaps the most insidious hazard of all. Hypothermia does not announce itself with pain or obvious symptoms. It begins as a subtle creeping numbness, a slight deterioration in concentration, a tendency toward careless movements. A diver with moderate hypothermia might not realize he is hypothermic. His judgment becomes impaired, and he may make decisions that are dangerous or even fatal. The standard protocol is to limit bottom time in cold water, to rotate divers regularly, to provide warming stations on the surface where divers can recover in hot tents or near fires. But in combat, these protocols are often honored more in the breach than in the observance. When ship needs to be cleared, when supplies are desperately needed, when the military situation is critical, tenders and commanding officers will ask divers to stay below longer, to work through the fatigue and the cold, to complete one more objective before returning to the surface. At Leningrad, the conditions represent perhaps the most extreme of all the harbors where military divers operated. The Neva River, which connects Leningrad to the sea, becomes partially frozen in winter. The ice forms in layers, first a thin skin that appears and disappears with the tides, then increasingly solid accumulations that can reach several feet thick. Divers must operate beneath this ice, which transforms the underwater environment into something approaching a cave system. The ice above becomes a ceiling with no easy access to the surface. The current beneath the ice is strong and often unpredictable. The water temperature drops to levels that would produce hypothermia in healthy men within minutes. Soviet divers working in these conditions have developed specialized techniques, including the use of hot water suits, canvas suits with tubes carrying hot water heated by steam generators on the surface. These suits are precarious and unreliable, the tubes prone to developing leaks, the steam generators vulnerable to failure, but they represent the best adaptation available to the brutal conditions of the Baltic winter. One Soviet diver named Petrov has worked the waters around Kronstadt, the fortress island that guards the approaches to Leningrad. Petrov has been working beneath the ice for so long that the cold has become almost familiar, almost normal in a way that defies rational explanation. His body has adapted in ways that medical science does not yet fully understand. His metabolic rate has elevated to the point where he consumes significantly more oxygen than an unexposed diver would, but this increased consumption somehow translates into greater heat production. His skin has become thickened and weathered, and his pain tolerance has increased dramatically. But Petrov is acutely aware that his body cannot maintain this state indefinitely. Every dive beneath the ice is, in some fundamental sense, a negotiation with death, a careful calculation of how much time he can spend in extreme cold without crossing the threshold from which his body cannot recover. The obstacles beneath the ice at Kronstadt are varied and complex. The Germans have created intricate systems of obstacles and barriers designed to prevent the Soviets from clearing the harbor for major naval operations. There are booms, long poles or cables connected to floats, designed to snag the propellers of ships. There are nets, deployed from underwater positions and weighted down with concrete. There are actual mines, but also elaborate decoys that look like mines but are designed simply to waste time and resources as the divers painstakingly investigate and clear them. Every objective requires meticulous work, and every objective must be conducted in conditions where a simple mistake could result in entanglement, loss of air, or hypothermia so severe that consciousness would be lost before the diver could signal for assistance. The tools used by all military divers during this period are fundamentally simple, designed by men who understood that complexity is the enemy of reliability in extreme conditions. The knife is the primary tool, a blade that is typically between 8 and 12 inches long, with a slight curve or serration to catch and hold material while cutting. The best knives for this work are made of high-quality steel that resists rust and maintains an edge despite the corrosive environment of salt water. German divers often used knives that were derived from bayonet designs, long and slender, while British and American divers frequently used curved knives more similar to tomahawks. Soviet divers used whatever was available, which often meant Russian-made knives that were pragmatic and functional, if not particularly elegant. The hammer is used for breaking concrete, for driving chisels, for working apart riveted or bolted structures that cutting alone cannot separate. The hammers used underwater are significantly heavier than their topside equivalents because the density and resistance of water means that the force of a blow is substantially reduced. A hammer that would weigh perhaps a kilogram on land might need to weigh 2 or 3 kilograms to achieve the desired effect in water. Many divers create their own hammers, fashioning heads from material at hand and lashing them to wooden handles with rope or wire. The saws are typically made of steel wire with handles fashioned from wood. These saws are used for cutting through cable and rope, and the friction created by the saw in water generates surprisingly little heat, so the work is not unduly accelerated by this mechanism. The saws must be drawn through the material with a deliberate, consistent stroke, neither too fast nor too slow. Rushing the cut results in the blade slipping, potentially causing injury to the diver's hands or destroying the saw itself. Going too slowly simply extends the already exhausting process of being underwater in extreme conditions. The line, the rope connecting diver to tender, is one of the most critical pieces of equipment. This line must be strong enough to support the weight of a fully suited diver, typically around 300 pounds, even if the diver is unconscious or unable to support himself. The line must also be visible to personnel on the surface, even in twilight or darkness, which is why many wartime divers used lines made from manila hemp, which was light-colored and readily visible. The line must also conduct signals, which it does through the system of pulls and vibrations. A tender who is skilled can communicate with a diver through subtle variations in the tension of a line, almost like a telegraph system conducted through rope rather than electricity. The apparatus that provides the diver with air is the critical link to life above the surface. In this era, closed-circuit rebreathers are the most commonly employed system, particularly for military divers operating at depths where the extended bottom time provided by oxygen recycling is advantageous. The rebreather functions by circulating the diver's exhaled breath through a chemical absorbent, typically soda lime, that removes carbon dioxide. The oxygen, which is not consumed by the exhalation but only by the metabolic demands of the body, is recirculated. A simple float mechanism allows additional oxygen to be injected into the system to replace what has been consumed, maintaining roughly constant pressure in the breathing bag. The system is elegant in its simplicity and dangerous in its limitations. If the absorbent becomes saturated and no longer removes carbon dioxide, the diver will begin to rebreathe his own waste gas. Carbon dioxide acts as a powerful narcotic at depth, and even small concentrations can produce confusion, impaired judgment, and unconsciousness. The most dangerous aspect of rebreather diving is that the narcotic effect of carbon dioxide can produce a loss of consciousness that occurs with no warning, no gradual deterioration, but rather an abrupt transition from functional capability to complete incapacity. Many divers have died from this cause, lost consciousness while underwater, and drowned before they could be rescued. The evidence is often invisible. A diver surfaces unresponsive, or in the worst cases, never surfaces at all. A body might be recovered days later, and an autopsy might reveal nothing obviously wrong, nothing that explains the death except the presence of water in the lungs and the elevated carbon dioxide levels in the blood. Over time, the rebreather systems were improved, the absorbents were better understood and more carefully managed, and protocols were developed to ensure that the absorbent was changed at appropriate intervals. But in the early stages of military diving, during the period when these operations were being improvised and refined, the losses were sometimes significant. The helmet itself is a masterpiece of Victorian-era engineering that remained largely unchanged into the 1940s. The Mark V helmet, in use by British and American divers, is constructed primarily of copper, with a rounded crown, a faceplate mounted on the front, and a lower collar that can be bolted or screwed into the diving suit. The faceplate itself is typically made of glass, allowing the diver to see out, though the narrow opening restricts the field of vision significantly. The glass can become obscured by condensation if the diver's breath is warmer than the surrounding water, creating a white film that must be periodically wiped clear. On the sides of the helmet are small ports through which air can enter from the rebreather bag, or can escape if the diver needs to vent pressure. The bottom of the helmet, where it meets the suit, has openings that allow water to enter and exit, which seems counterintuitive, but is actually essential to the function of the system. If the helmet were completely sealed, the diver would be crushed by pressure as he descended, the external pressure eventually crushing the sides of the helmet inward. The small opening at the bottom allows water to enter the helmet, equalizing the pressure inside and outside, allowing the diver to remain unharmed. The suit itself is typically a full-body garment constructed from what is called dress fabric, a heavy cloth that is often wool or a wool blend. The suit is typically soaked in linseed oil or another similar preparation, which makes it water-resistant and helps it maintain some insulation properties. The suit has a weight and heft that is initially overwhelming to the wearer. It typically weighs between 30 and 50 pounds when dry, and considerably more when saturated with water. The lead weights, attached to the belt and boots, add another 50 to 100 pounds depending on the required depth and the anticipated tasks. For a diver operating at moderate depths with simple cutting tasks, 100 pounds of lead is typical. For deeper work, or work that requires greater maneuverability, the weight distribution might be adjusted, sometimes with weights distributed between the belt and the chest plate. The boots are designed specifically for diving work, with a flange or lip on the bottom that allows the diver to shuffle along the bottom without fully lifting his feet from the ground. This technique, called shuffle walking, allows the diver to maintain his position and orientation even in zero visibility. The diver can feel the bottom through his feet, can sense changes in topography, can avoid being swept away by currents that would pick up a diver who is swimming or floating. Many divers become proficient enough at shuffle walking that they can conduct fairly complex work while maintaining this awkward gait, using their hands to cut or clear obstacles while their feet remain in contact with the ground beneath them. The gloves deserve particular mention because they represent one of the most frustrating challenges for divers of this era. The gloves must be thick enough to provide some protection from the cold and from the sharp edges of metal and concrete frequently encountered underwater. But they must also allow enough dexterity that the diver can perform fine motor tasks like tying knots or making precise cuts with a knife. The solutions vary. Some divers use thick wool gloves that quickly become saturated and lose insulation value. Others use leather gloves which maintain their shape better but become stiff and hard in cold water, making it difficult to bend the fingers. Many divers compromise, wearing a thin inner glove of leather or oilcloth and a thicker outer glove of wool. But no solution is perfect, and nearly every diver's account of wartime diving work includes complaints about the gloves, how they became numb, how the dexterity was never quite adequate, how the fingers within the gloves would sometimes cramp into rigid claws despite the effort to remain flexible. The process of preparing for a dive is itself a complex ritual that must be executed with precision. The diver begins by putting on the suit, which is an awkward process involving multiple people and considerable maneuvering to ensure that all the straps and closures are properly fastened. The suit must be snug enough to prevent excessive water from flowing inside, but not so tight that it restricts blood circulation. Once the suit is in place, the lead weights are attached to the belt and checked to ensure they are secured properly. The helmet is then mounted, lowered carefully over the diver's head, and bolted or screwed into the collar of the suit. The sensation of having the helmet lowered is one that every diver experiences as simultaneously reassuring and claustrophobic. It is reassuring because it means that the preparation is nearly complete and the work is about to begin. It is claustrophobic because the field of vision is suddenly and dramatically restricted, and the diver is now completely enclosed in his suit and helmet, breathing equipment that is now entirely mechanical and dependent on the equipment and attention of the people on the surface. The final check is for the air supply and the communication line. The tender connects the air hose to the helmet, and a brief pulse of air indicates that the supply is functioning. The communication line, the signal rope, is attached to the diver's belt, and a brief test of the signal system ensures that the tender can feel the rope clearly. The diving ladder or the side of the platform is descended carefully, and as the diver enters the water, there is initially an overwhelming sensation of pressure around the body as the water begins to support some of the weight. The sensation is often described by divers as a profound relief because once in the water, the weight of the suit and equipment is supported by buoyancy, and the physical strain is reduced. The descent continues, the diver's feet finding the rungs of a ladder, continuing downward until the diver is ready to leave the ladder and begin moving laterally toward the work site. The signals and communication that occur between tender and diver are the lifeblood of safe diving operations. The system is based on tugs on the line and the presence or absence of tension. Beyond the basic signals indicating distress or completion of objectives, tenders can sense the physical state of the diver through subtle variations in the line's tension. A diver who is working normally maintains a relatively steady tension on the line, moving carefully and deliberately. A diver who is panicking creates a chaotic pattern of jerks and vibrations. A diver who is struggling with a particularly difficult task might increase tension significantly as he pulls against a line for leverage. Experienced tenders learn to read these patterns, and they can usually predict when a diver needs to be brought to the surface, sometimes even before the diver himself realizes that he has reached his limit. The work is conducted with remarkable efficiency given the extreme conditions. A trained diver can cut through a cable maybe 6 to 8 inches in diameter in approximately 15 minutes, assuming reasonable visibility and no unexpected complications. The same cable might take 45 minutes or longer if visibility is poor or if the cable is in an awkward position that requires the diver to approach from unusual angles. When multiple obstacles are encountered, the time multiplies. A single dive might be planned to last anywhere from 10 to 45 minutes, depending on depth and the anticipated task load. The longest dives in cold water rarely exceed an hour because the physiological demands become unsustainable beyond that point. The dangers multiply when the work progresses beyond simple cutting and clearing operations into more complex demolition work. Sometimes obstacles are so massive or so heavily constructed that cutting alone will not suffice. In these cases, the sappers might decide to use explosives, either attached to the underwater obstacles directly or placed in positions designed to detonate adjacent structures. These explosive operations require the most experienced and skilled divers, men who have trained specifically in demolition work and who understand the mechanics of how explosives function underwater. Water is incompressible, which means that the force of an underwater explosion transmits with tremendous power through the water itself, creating shock waves that can rupture organs, break bones, or kill outright even at considerable distances from a blast. A diver placed too close to an explosion will not survive, and many divers have been killed by underwater explosions that were detonated at what were believed to be safe distances. The Soviet operations at Leningrad represent some of the most extreme examples of this work. The situation at Leningrad was desperate in the extreme. The city had been under siege for extended periods, and the harbor was crucial for maintaining supply lines and conducting naval operations. Divers were asked to work in conditions so extreme that many of them did not survive their assignments. The ice above created particular dangers because it limited the number of places where a diver could surface, and an injured or incapacitated diver trapped beneath the ice might have no way to reach the surface before drowning. The Soviets responded by developing increasingly sophisticated systems for signaling and rescue. Ropes were pre-positioned beneath the ice, creating paths that a diver could follow to navigate to emergency exit points even in zero visibility. Rescue procedures were developed that allowed for the rapid retrieval of an incapacitated diver and the immediate provision of resuscitation techniques. The German experience in the Baltic was somewhat different, but no less demanding. The Germans operated dive teams that were particularly sophisticated in their technical approach, developing systems and procedures that were innovative and often ahead of what the Allies were accomplishing. But the Germans faced the same fundamental challenges: extreme cold, poor visibility, strong currents, and the omnipresent danger of explosions and booby traps. Many German divers were killed during operations to clear harbors and sea lanes in the Baltic, and the losses were particularly severe as the war progressed and the Soviet Navy became increasingly active. By 1945, the experience and expertise of military divers had expanded dramatically. The knowledge accumulated from years of operations in various theaters was beginning to be systematized and standardized. Training programs became more formal, more rigorous, more focused on preparing new divers for the extreme conditions they would encounter. The equipment, while still fundamentally similar to the systems used in 1943, had been refined and improved. The protocols for safe diving, for managing the physiological hazards, for conducting rescue operations, had all been codified through hard experience and often through tragic losses. The work at Antwerp in late 1944 and early 1945 represented the culmination of these efforts. The harbor clearance operations were conducted with increasing professionalism and efficiency. The death rate among divers remained significant. A loss rate of perhaps 5 to 10% across the entire operation was not uncommon for sustained harbor clearance work in wartime conditions. But the survival rate was substantially higher than it had been in the earlier operations, and much more work was being accomplished with fewer casualties. The supply ships that had been blocked from entering the harbor for months were finally able to proceed up the Scheldt and into Antwerp proper, delivering ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements to the advancing Allied forces. The human cost of these operations is difficult to quantify precisely because many of the losses occurred in theaters far from the main areas of conventional conflict and were sometimes recorded imprecisely. But what is clear is that military divers operated in some of the most extreme and dangerous conditions of the entire war. The men who did this work were typically volunteers, selected from among sailors and soldiers for their ability to function in extreme environments, for their courage, and their willingness to subordinate their individual fears to the demands of the military objective. Many of them were young men, 19, 20, 25 years old, doing work that would have seemed impossible if they had really contemplated the risks beforehand. The exhaustion experienced by divers after extended operations is almost beyond description. A diver who has completed 8 or 10 dives in a day has not simply worked physically. He has experienced repeated cycles of extreme stress, compressed exertion, and dangerous conditions. The psychological toll is profound. Nightmares are common among experienced divers. Some develop a form of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, though in the wartime context, it was simply called war nerves or sometimes diagnosed as a form of what was then called battle fatigue. The condition was real, however, regardless of what it was called. Men who had worked extensively as military divers sometimes found that they could no longer sleep deeply, that their concentration was affected, that they became easily startled or irritable. Many of them experienced a profound sense of disconnection from civilian life after the war, a feeling that the experiences they had undergone were so far outside the normal range of human experience that they could not be adequately explained to people who had not been through similar trials. Yet there was also a profound pride in the work and a sense of camaraderie among divers that was particularly intense because the work was so dangerous and so demanding. Divers who served together, who worked the same harbors and the same operations, developed bonds that often lasted for the rest of their lives. The stories they told each other, the gallows humor that developed in response to the extreme conditions, the small celebrations when a difficult objective was finally accomplished, all of these created a culture that was specific to the diving community and that set them apart from other military branches. By the end of the war, the divers had accomplished remarkable things. Harbors that had been rendered completely unusable were reopened. Supply lines that had been severed were restored. Ports that had been blockaded were made available for major naval and supply operations. The work was unglamorous and largely invisible. It was not the subject of newsreels or propaganda films, not the subject of official commendations or decorations on the same scale as more visible military operations. But without this work, many of the Allied operations would have been impossible or would have proceeded at a much reduced pace and with greater difficulty. The final operations of the war in the European theater included diving work at Kiel and other German ports as the Allies pushed into the German heartland. These operations were often conducted in conditions of particular danger because the Germans, aware that they were losing the war, often booby-trapped their own facilities, assuming that the Allies might eventually capture them. The mines and explosives were more sophisticated, the booby traps more complex, and the overall situation more hazardous. But the divers by this stage of the war were among the most experienced and skilled of the entire Allied military. They had learned through bitter experience how to identify German booby trap patterns, how to work around them, how to accomplish their objectives with minimal loss of life. The operations were successful, and the harbors that were cleared allowed the final operations of the war to proceed more efficiently. When the war ended, many divers were simply demobilized and returned to civilian life. Some returned to the diving professions that they had pursued before the war: commercial salvage, construction, maintenance work on underwater structures. Others found that civilian diving work seemed mundane and unsatisfying after the intensity of wartime operations. Some became instructors, training the next generation of military divers and ensuring that the knowledge that had been accumulated through wartime experience would not be lost. Others pursued entirely different careers, the diving work becoming a chapter in their lives rather than their primary identity. The legacy of military diving during World War II includes not just the practical accomplishment of having open harbors and supply lines, but also the advancement of diving science and safety procedures. The research into decompression sickness, into the physiological effects of nitrogen narcosis, into the prevention and treatment of hypothermia, all of this research was advanced by the necessity of understanding these conditions in military divers. The technical improvements in diving equipment, in rebreathers and helmets and communication systems, were partly driven by military demands. After the war, this knowledge and these technical improvements became available for civilian use, and diving itself became safer and more accessible for non-military purposes. The divers themselves are now largely gone or are reaching advanced age. The youngest of the wartime divers are in their late 70s or 80s, and few new accounts are being added to the historical record. But the accounts that do remain, the memoirs and oral histories that have been preserved, the equipment that is displayed in maritime museums, the procedural documents that are archived in military collections, all of these represent a remarkable legacy of human courage and ingenuity in response to extreme necessity. The men who cut cables in zero visibility beneath the ice at Leningrad, who swam through turbid harbors under sniper fire in Naples, who worked with frozen fingers to clear the channel at Cherbourg, who navigated the deadly currents of the Scheldt beneath Antwerp, these men performed work of extraordinary difficulty and danger for causes that they believed in. The obstacles they cleared allowed the prosecution of the war to continue. The supplies that flowed into Europe through the harbors they opened sustained the armies that eventually defeated Nazi Germany. The work was unglamorous and largely unheralded, but its importance was absolute. The knife, the hammer, and the line, these simple tools, combined with human courage and an extraordinary willingness to function in extreme and dangerous environments, accomplished work that in any objective sense seems impossible. The divers did not have the sophisticated equipment of later eras. They did not have the extensive training infrastructure that would be developed in subsequent decades. They did not have full understanding of all the physiological challenges they would face. What they had was determination, a degree of courage that is difficult to adequately characterize, and the support of teammates above and below the surface who believed in the importance of the work. They went into the water despite knowing the dangers, and they came back up again and did it again the next day, and the day after that, until the work was done and the harbors were open. If you have found this story compelling and moving, if you want to continue learning about the untold histories of World War II, about the men who did extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, then please subscribe to our channel. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told, stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve to be remembered and honored. Join our community of history enthusiasts and help ensure that these remarkable accounts are preserved and shared with future generations. Subscribe now. And thank you for witnessing these stories with us.